Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to the show. Sorry we're a bit late. That's the left. We're not always known for our prompt nature, to be brutally honest. It's a big pleasure to be doing a very, very important show today. We have two extremely important topics to talk about. Before kick-off, I've been in quarantine for the last 8 days. Alas, I did get struck by the dreaded Delta variant of COVID. That was before my second jab came into action. Now, I actually am feeling a lot better. I did get hit by, I know this is probably not that interesting, but I think it's interesting for people perhaps who maybe have got COVID or because there has been a bit of a surge. There are some promising signs, but I basically got struck by quite severe fatigue, and I didn't really know what fatigue meant until I got struck with it. And it is very debilitating. You can't actually do anything. So it did make me think about people for whom chronic fatigue is obviously not a condition that appears for a few days, but for huge periods of time. And it's something definitely I would like to talk about based on that very limited experience. But anyway, I'm feeling a lot better myself. Today, we are talking about two very, very, very important issues. Later on, we are going to be talking about Apsana Begum, who is a Labour MP who has been completely and utterly exonerated on the charges brought against her by Tower Hamlets Council related to alleged fraud to do with housing, though complete exoneration, complete vindication. And we're very lucky later to be joined by her lawyer, Raj Chada, who successfully, of course, defended her. But we're going to look at what the case tells us, the wider implications of the case, because there's some very, very important wider issues to talk about. So we'll talk about that later on. To begin with, though, we're going to be talking about new revelations to do with Tory donors. Now, this is in the Financial Times. The Financial Times did a splash. Elite Tory Donors Club holds secret meetings with Johnson, who is, of course, our beloved Prime Minister. We'll be talking about this. This is a so-called advisory panel of Tory donors who have provided vast sums of money to the Conservative Party. And I know a lot of you already, and this is what worries me about the response to this. People are a bit like, oh, bear shit in woods, etc., etc., etc. What do you expect from the Conservatives? That itself, I think that attitude is worrying because it normalizes the corruption of our democracy, which was won through the struggle and sacrifice of huge numbers of people over many generations and centuries. That democracy has huge caveats, not least because the wealthy and powerful find ways to game the system in their interest, which is what we'll be talking about. The wider issues in terms of the details of this scandal, which should be treated as a scandal, though despite the Financial Times commendably, of course, doing this splash, it's not getting pick up elsewhere. But, other examples of it and what it shows about the corruption of British democracy. Now, before I bring in our first brilliant guest, Solomon Hughes, who's a fantastic investigative journalist we're very lucky to have, just some usual housekeeping. If you're watching this live, do click through to YouTube. Watch it. It just helps the channel if you watch it on YouTube. Just click the YouTube link and then press like, and that helps the algorithm, and subscribe. And also, this channel is kept afloat and the podcast by your support. We're doing a documentary on Who Owns Britain, which is going to be a very interesting documentary about it does what it says on the tin. But we're going to look into detail both in urban and rural Britain, the people who own this country. So that is made possible because that's a huge amount of time and resources with our brilliant team through your support on patreon.com/OwenJones84. You can also support the channel using Super Chat, where on YouTube, you can just click and ask questions to the guests. And I will thank everybody at the end who supports the show by doing that. We've got our podcast, of course, which is a huge part of our audience. So do listen to the podcast, subscribe to the podcast, and support us there. Right, that's enough from me. I'm going to bring in the brilliant investigative journalist, Solomon Hughes. Hey, Solomon, how you doing?
Hey, Owen.
Great to see you. So I just want to start with this story in the FT. So basically, let's set the scene as the Financial Times did. It's June the 28th, not long after Matt Hancock resigned after, for example, discharging vulnerable patients from hospitals into the care sector, which ravaged the care sector with huge numbers of deaths. But because he was obviously caught on camera canoodling with his someone he was having an affair with, who was appointed at public money, public expense in that post. But anyway, so Boris Johnson's driven to this Kensington townhouse. It's all organised by Ben Elliott, who's the chair of the Conservatives. He's the beating heart of the party's fundraising operation. He runs something called Quintessentially, which is a concierge company. They style themselves as a luxury lifestyle management service. They look after the desires of the wealthy, and they send Madonna and people all sorts of very niche products. Some of the richest people in London are there. It's being hosted by Rishi Khosla, who's a banker. These are key Tory donors. Some of the richest people in the capital. Peter Cruddas, the tycoon who gave £500,000, he was elevated to the House of Lords. Howard Shaw, founder of Shaw Capital, gave the party £250,000. Now, these are members of a secretive so-called advisory board. Now, this is an advisory board which doesn't appear anywhere in the party's literature, but under Elliott has been described as the most desirable club in the Tory party, where these wealthy donors get monthly access to Boris Johnson or Rishi Sunak. I'm just wondering, what's your thoughts? Let's just take your initial thoughts.
Well, it's a good story by the FT. And what they've done is, if the Conservative Party is a video game, they've unlocked a secret boss level where you have to, where something else is going on. We know the Conservative Party for years has said that it has donor clubs, which if you give a certain amount of money, you'll get a certain amount of access. And the top one of these was the Leaders Group. You pay 50 grand, you get to go for dinner maybe once a quarter or something like that with top ministers. And so what the FT have found is that even above the donor, the Leaders Club, there's another one, the advisory board, where you have to pay 250 grand and you get to meet them every month, it sounds like. So even within this, the sale of influence, there's a secret higher level. There's like a the kind of VIP part of the club behind the rope, and that's bad. That's really bad. It's not democracy as we understand it. And it underlines how the Conservative Party acts as a kind of machine for the super rich to tell the middle class what to tell the rest of us to think. So it's a good story. It's a good story. And I think Ben Elliott is a really interesting character in it, because he has come into business as an influence, as either servicing the ultra rich or trying to help corporations with influence, those two things. And it's almost like, well, so the Conservative Party has therefore become something that serves the ultra rich or helps corporate interests, which it just seems very direct, very on the nose. If you were writing the film script of this would have sounded too corny, I think.
Yeah, I mean, we know, for example, there's a 250 club of donors who gave $250,000 or more. There were party spokespersons denied the existence of such a group. But anyway, it includes, for example, the likes of Lyubov Chernykin, who's the wife of the former Russian minister Vladimir Chernykin. It's quite interesting that, because obviously we saw back in 2018, the Labour Party was particularly hammered as though it was the stooge of the Russian regime, when dubious money linked to the Russian regime can actually be directly linked to the Conservative Party. Hedge fund managers, for example, the wife of Wafik Saeed, a Syrian-born businessman known for his role in the UK Saudi Al Yamana arms sale. Now, the Conservative Party say government policies are in no way influenced by the donations the party receives. They are entirely separate. What I think is interesting is, for example, back in 2012, here's an example, the Financial Times, again, wrote, and this was when, it wasn't long after the Labour Party had, under Gordon Brown, they'd actually increased the top rate of tax to 50p, which was then reduced to 45 under George Osborne, the then Chancellor. And a City donor said to the Financial Times, there probably aren't many votes in cutting the 50p top rate of tax, But among those that give significant amounts to the party, it's a big issue, and that's probably why it's a big issue for the party too. I mean, basically, these rich donors aren't just going, well, I've got a bit of spare cash lying around. They just really just think, or just help out the Tories.
It's just. I mean, there's just really basic things, aren't there? He who pays the piper calls the tune, isn't it? That's just that's what we understand. That's how we understand the world. There's also a really basic thing about journalism where. Everyone who goes to any kind of journalism school, they'll learn about Watergate, where two plucky journalists uncovered a huge scandal that brought down the president of the United States because President Nixon was running this huge secret illegal smear campaign, and that's the heroes for all journalists. And Woodward and Bernstein's lesson was, and they said this explicitly, was follow the money. If you want to find out what's going on, follow the money. The Financial Times have done a good job here doing that, but it's actually done not enough by journalists, and surprisingly little. I mean, I got into journalism because I did it a little bit, and there's just a huge gap, and it's not done enough. I think it's slightly improved since the financial crisis, that journalists have become more sensitive to the idea that very rich people are making things happen badly and doing it through political influence. So it's got a bit better, but it's still not good enough. I think the other interesting thing, I think we'll find more about donors over time. It's useful to just get a value. 250 grand is just a useful value. It means every time, because we can see the donations, we should look at that donations at 250 grand and inspect them more closely, because we did that before when the admitted lower level donor club of 50 grand was announced, which is some years back. It means that ever since then, the better journalists have paid attention to that sum. If someone donates 50 grand, you just think, oh, okay, so they're particularly close to the Prime Minister. What have they gained from it? And sometimes you just try and work your way backwards. I mean, really obvious one, vast amount of property donations for house builders and other property developers in the Conservative Party. In the Financial Times article, they focus on the idea that actually the Conservative Party is going to really start tearing up planning rules. I think they're interested in that because middle-class shire Tories like planning rules because they're all basically NIMBYs, but ultra-rich property developers don't, so they think there'll be a conflict within the Conservative Party. And I think that is an interesting thing that will show the limits of democracy within the Conservative Party itself. I think we should be more interested in the limits of democracy within society. So the really obvious things are we have very high levels of homelessness, house prices are high, rents are high, but the government is subsidizing housing firms through Help to Buy, which it just lets some people buy properties through a state-backed loan, but it actually pushes up housing prices because it's just increasing money in the market rather than increasing the number of houses, let alone affordable houses that are built. So that's a really obvious one. There's just there are very direct things between the property industry, property lobby funding the Conservative Party. There's very basic things between incredibly rich people funding the Conservative Party and that pulling down the possibility of increasing taxes. Or if a tax increase happens, it might happen in national insurance, which weighs more heavily on ordinary people and less on the I keep saying rich. Let's just the term that the quintessentially like to use, Ben Elliott's firm, is ultra high net worth individuals, and that's people who've got about 20 million pounds investable. They've got to have more money than that. They've got like 20 million pounds spare cash, if you like. So they like to talk about ultra high net worth individuals, which you see that phrase a lot. And I think people like, or the rich people like it because it sounds like it's got that phrase, the word worth in it. So it makes them sound like they're worth more. So there are ultra high net worth individuals, which I think it means really filthy rich. And then there are high net worth individuals who are filthy rich, and then there's the merely the rich below them.
In terms of democracy and what this says about a democracy, I mean, another striking example is peerages, which is indicative, which is people being elevated to the House of Lords. And last year, for example, the Mirror had this story about, they said 15 wealthy Tory donors over the last decade and a half have been handed peerages. One example, I've already mentioned him, is Peter Cruddas, who was made a peerage made appear earlier this year after giving £500,000 to the Tories against the advice of the Lord's appointment watchdog. Now, he actually resigned, people might remember this, as Tory party co-treasurer in 2012 after being caught in a cash for access sting involving offering access to David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, and George Osborne, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer, for that magic number, £250,000. So, I mean, that's quite, I mean, you know, again, I mean, it's not just the Conservatives who do this, and it's and we'll come on to Labour actually shortly, but, you know, you don't have to be some sort of, it's not a conspiracy theory to go, oh, look, there's a load of rich.
Yeah, I think this is really just a great point to think, how would this process in this country be reported if we were a small developing nation? You know, business associates of the ruling party have been placed in the legislature despite concerns over questionable funds. You know, it just would look like it's banana republic stuff, really, at the risk of insulting countries that rely on banana production. And it's quite interesting if you think about it. The point of getting a peerage is this: on the one hand, it's saying to somebody who's got a lot of money, you can have political influence. But on the other hand, it also says, we'll give you this, you know, if you become a peer, it's like, we'll give you this big badge that says you're an important and respectable person, which will help you get further money. So it's feels to me like a very one hand washes the other thing. You know, you do a favor, you give us money, we give you a peerage, which means you still have political influence because you can do things in the House of Lords because we've got this ridiculous House of Lords. Then in turn, it also gives you respectability. So you can, you know, you'll find it easier to raise investment if you can send something out with House of Lords notepaper. Very occasionally, some of them get a bit cagey about it, because it does mean there are very minimal reporting standards where you have to say what you are up to and what you do. But they're even weaker than much weaker than the House of Commons ones. I mean, I just think for the democracy, honestly, I would tell you what I would tell people to do. Have a read of the Financial Times article, but just go on the quintessentially website, because it just feels so greasy and disgusting, to be honest. I started writing about Ben Elliott in 2019 when he got the job, because it was just too easy. So quintessentially, it's a concierge service, and that there's been more and more concierge services rising, and that means a concierge service is somebody who will give a lifestyle manager to the ultra rich, you know, a sort of super valet or butler who will get you tickets. They'll help you buy property. They might help you, not quintessentially doesn't do this, but others do. They might help you get citizenship. They would help you get your kid, and quintessentially say they do this. Will help you get your kid in a top university, where they'll, you know, tutor them and give you the links and the contacts and all the rest of it. There's a luxury lifestyle management firm, personal shopping, you know, so it is like personal shopping for politics, isn't it? Now he's taken the model he had for his sort of slightly creepy what can I do for you, Mr. Rich Person service, and he's just transferred that to the Conservative Party. The Conservative Party is, rich person, what can we do for you? What personal thing would you like to buy? I mean, the Conservative Party often, other parties do, but often has that element. There's the at Conservative balls, they invite all the rich people who are donors, and it's quite expensive for a ticket, but you also get to hobnob both with the government and with other people who are there. And this past summer ball, we couldn't work it out. There were all these funny donations. Sometimes this is, sorry, I'm digressing slightly, but the actual value that we know 250 grand is the value to join the advisory board is useful, because it means then you inspect everyone who donates 250 grand. In the last year, the summer ball, which is another good time to look at who has influence in the ear of the Prime Minister, the summer ball was a virtual ball. And we figured this out because everyone's kept donating. All these top Tory donors and business people all donated £9,854 to the party, and we couldn't figure out what's that about. And it turned out it's because it's a virtual ball, they weren't there in person, that they each got a hamper worth £146, and they took that off the price of the donation, because they said, well, that's not a donation, we actually got this hamper. So they all sat on a Zoom call with this £146 hamper, sort of hobnobbing with ministers. Very directly, at least at that virtual ball, there was one firm that won no bid contracts for PPE supplies. You can often work backwards and find a very direct relationship that appears to show, you can't prove it, but it appears to show that having favoured access is beneficial. And sometimes it's just a general thing. Rich people don't like taxes, but if we don't increase taxes on the rich, society will not do well. It's just, so there's a specific interest and also general interest. But yeah, really seriously, going back to what I was saying at the beginning of that rather rambling point, was just look on the website at Quintessentially and think that's who is running Conservative Party fundraising.
As Stephen Calder on Super Chat says, maybe the PM and his ministers should wear sponsorship logos on their clothes like footballers so that people know who they really work for. I actually quite like that idea. It's a nice idea.
No, I tell you, this is actually, you'll know this from when you go to party conferences. It's a really odd thing, is you go to party conferences, and if you go to all the events on the fringe, there will be ministers speaking, and all the events are sponsored by with donations tends to be individuals, not exclusively, but it tends to be ultra high net worth individuals. At the conference, the events tend to be sponsored by corporations, and it's really direct. So all the privatization corporations will pay for a meeting with the minister. So it'll be ATOS, and there will be the minister for whatever, for disability or what have you, and it's really direct. It is almost like they're wearing a logo, because there'll be the sign for the corporation, and then there will be a thanks by the chair on behalf of the corporation, and then the minister will say something which inevitably and invariably will be friendly to that corporation. What happens in that is, two things that strike me on that is, when you go to party conferences, it looks really weird. You look at, why are all these corporate logos everywhere? Why is everything sponsored? Why is every meeting actually seems to be, pay for play, pay for access? The kind of little glass of white wine and the vol au vent you're eating is paid for by Serco or Atos or G4S, and then the minister speaks. It really does feel like it is a sort of corporate sponsored event. It looks weird, but it's rarely reported. I tend to do that. I tend to do a report once a year. I'll do a report somewhere that will just list all the logos, and it always gets interesting coverage. But it is something that the big papers don't report as much or half as much. And I think the problem with them is they're just used to it. They see it every year, so it's not new, but it's actually weird. That's the honest truth, and often absurd. There's sometimes the people who organize the meetings, who act as intermediaries between the corporations and the ministers, is typically think tanks. They all get the sponsorship for the event, and they'll issue a report saying there should be more privatization of disability benefits, brought to you by Atos, and they'll have the minister. But sometimes it's the magazines that do this, and the Spectator, just to be in with the government, runs a series of sponsored meetings at every conference. And the Spectator also produces its own branded gin, which is a rather over-flavored gin. And the last, I think it was not last year, but the year before, or maybe the year before that, I was at a Spectator conference meeting on trade, which was sponsored by the Cayman Islands government, so it's sponsored by a tax haven. And I think my memory's a little weak here. It was a minister was on the panel saying the Cayman Islands are great, and the Cayman Islands guy was on the panel saying the Cayman Islands are great. I can't entirely remember. I think it may have been Esther McVeigh, but I'm not 100% sure on that. And because the Cayman Islands had paid for it, they got a minister in, they got a big audience, but everyone was also given all this free Spectator gin. And so by the end of it, it was just this whole room full of ruddy, drunken Tories, because the gin was free, all, half cut on gin, cheering the idea of tax avoidance. It was Hogarthian, but so that element of sponsorship and of just politics being rather bought, it's great. The FT have got a good story here. There've been other good stories this week. There's a good story in the Mirror about a Russian banker funding Dominic Raab, but there's not enough, and there's not as much as would describe reality.
I mean, it's interesting too, because there was just as another example about how this all works. Before the 2019 election, there's this black and white ball the Tories put on with donors, where Tory donors splashed tens of thousands on cosy dinners with ministers, hunting trips, luxury holidays. £75,000 for a night out with Theresa May, just for the scintillating conversation. She's a real raconteur, that Theresa May, so that would have been a real investment. Anyway, the Tory chairman, Brandon Lewis, told guests, whatever you bid at the auction, it's less than you'll pay in tax under Corbyn. Now, that's quite an interesting tidbit, because whilst now history is often revised because history is written by victors, but there was a period of time when a Corbyn-led government seemed like a genuine, real political possibility. And the Financial Times and other newspapers reported the super rich panicking and making plans to try and squirrel away money and all the rest of it in advance of a Corbyn government of some description. And this fleshes out how much of the super rich see the Conservative Party, which is that it's a party that exists to represent and defend their class interests. And when the party of Labour had taken a particular political turn, which made it more of a menace and a threat, it wasn't going to have an accommodation with Thatcherism as it did under New Labour, where corporation tax was cut year after year, income tax was kept low. The city was deregulated and all the rest with catastrophic consequences. So actually, even though they're splashing out all this money, they know it's an investment because it would prevent a government taking a lot more money off them to invest in social programs, for example, that they don't believe in.
Oh, I think it's you've got two different elements. You've got the big donors, the big ultra high net worth individual donors, and they've got the money. I mean, that's the main thing, and I think they're so they've got the money. They want to spend it somewhere, and of course they'll spend it on the party of power to make sure they keep the money. There's also an element to which, and I think you see this sometimes, is that where donors give money to the Conservative Party, they feel it buys them an element of respectability. It buys them. So you sometimes see people who are wanting to buy. They've made a lot of money, but some people a little bit iffy about them. So there's an element where it buys them an entry into the British establishment. So there's that process going on as well. Which is it's always interesting to investigate who's donated. I mean, to be honest, I've often found that if you look at somebody who's donated and you look hard enough, eventually something bad will surface about them. A long time I spent chasing a company called Leica Mobile that sells cheap mobile phone calls for people, particularly who diaspora people who want to phone back home to migrant people to their mums and dads and what have you. So Leica Mobile were big Tory donor, and they came from nowhere. And I thought, oh, well, what's going on there? Just kept looking at it, and kept finding that their tax was very low. As a business, their tax was very low. And I raised in a number of both in The Guardian and Private Eye, which is where I mostly work, raised issues about this. And we finally figured out that they had a mechanism to avoid tax, which involved, complicated movements between countries. And the more you wrote about it, I thought there's something going on here. And eventually in their annual report, it turned up that they are in fact being investigated now by the Inland Revenue, who think that they owe them a lot of tax. This still isn't settled. But I just think sometimes, just the fact that they're giving money to the Conservative Party is that they have a general interest in shaping society, but sometimes they have a specific interest in making themselves look respectable if they feel in a way that they're people who may be examined as not respectable otherwise.
Now, we talked about the Tories. Let's just have a little chat about Labour, because, Labour, it's been reported in the Times, is seeking billionaire cash as Labour struggles to pay staff. They're seeking money, including from the founder of outsourcing company Capita. Oh dear. A billionaire property developer, an heiress to the Tetra Pak fortune, the granddaughter of the founder of River Island. I mean, basically, under whatever people, think about the previous administration, Labour was flush with cash, partly because it became the biggest political party, or one of them in depends how you define it, in Europe, but well over 500,000 members. So that infused it with a huge amount of cash. Obviously, Labour has the support of trade unions, who some attempt to equate with big money. There's a very big difference. Trade unions are democratic political movements which use the small donations which working people pay. The whole point of Labour was it's founded to be the political wing of working people through the trade unions. That's a transparent process. People can see, in terms of how that works, rather than big money who are after selfish personal ends, seeking profit, of course. But now, because the membership has fallen so steeply in Labour, also these settlements, I mean, for example, over Panorama, many argued Labour could have won that case. But in any case, Labour has now a mass cash crisis. So they've gone cap in hand to billionaires. And we can see, as we talked about the Tories, that rich people do not give this money over expecting nothing in return. And Labour, founded to represent working people, hence the name, the fact it's now been reduced to this. And also, I mean, are they actually even going to get this money? Because, because frankly, a lot of them are quite happy with it. I mean, they might not be great. They might not think Brexit's great, but that's not going to be reversed under Labour anyway. So, I mean, what do you think anyway?
Well, I think they will get some, but I think the problem is New Labour, the last Labour government, was able to raise a large corporate donations because they were the party of power. Once you're in government, everyone wants to give you money. They don't necessarily want to give you money to get into government. There's a minority section of the rich people who want to see they see it as a kind of more long game and will back Labour. I mean, this is where I came in. I just feel like I'm just going in Groundhog Day now. I came into journalism in the late 90s, and one of the things I spotted was there was a big American company. Well, this is the thing. What I spotted was that Labour were advertising, we're interested in corporations backing us. We're the party, not just of Labour, but also capital. We're New Labour. One of the first companies I saw backing them was a company called Enron. And you could just see they were stank. Enron were involved in a big... they're an energy company, sort of, and they're involved in a big power station in India. And all the local fisher folk objected to this power station, so they all got beat up mysteriously. Enron were really dodgy, horrible company with close links to the Republicans. And you just looked at the thought, this isn't good. And so raised a bit of a stink about it. And of course, within a few years, it turns out that Enron is not just a dodgy corporation, but a giant conspiracy, even on its own investors. And it exploded it just was one of the great financial scandals of our time. And that's, you start touting for money. That's who you end up getting it from. Honestly, if they're going to do that again, and whilst it got them a lot of money, it also caused them a huge amount of problems, so that cash for access became a Labour problem. The people who gave them money, lots of people around the banks were interested in them. So Labour got involved in the private finance initiative, and that it helped them in the short term, but it became a nightmare in the long term. It becomes a problem. You can look at it in a high way, a political way. This theory of social democracy is that we're all equal at the ballot box, but unequal in society. So we can use our power in the ballot box to make society more equal. But if the ballot box or the political parties are themselves also fixed, it doesn't feel like social democracy. It feels like managed democracy. It feels like you've got the choice between two things. That's the big way of looking at it. The little way of looking at it is Labour can go in and say, they can try and win votes by saying, look, the Conservatives are just the party of the super rich and they're all a bit dodgy. But if they are at the same time doing this, it muddies the water. It just removes clarity, which is precisely what happened to Labour, who went from this big high vote in 97 to, then slowly that tailing away. People point to the Iraq War, but it was also the private finance initiative, the sense that they weren't different, the sense they were all the same. Also, it has to be the sense that it was all the same. One of the mechanisms was the revolving door, where this happens with Conservatives as well, but with lots of Labour ministers when they left Parliament, or even when they're still in Parliament but left ministerial office, got jobs with investment companies that invested in NHS privatisation. Alan Milburn, former health secretary, was a famous case of that. And it creates the "you're all the same" narrative, which is actually poisonous for Labour. Will they get it? And will they get it? I mean, obviously, they'll get some, but they won't get that much. And we've seen as a financial model, the original financial model of the Labour Party was raise money from members and trade unions, and it worked. And then this was reinvented under Corbyn, where the party was doing really, really well financially because it had just loads of members. It didn't need big donors, and it was more stable as well. One big donor can walk out in a huff, whereas with members, it's their annual subscriptions, they don't churn so badly. So they'll get some. There are some signs they'll get some, but I think they're already bad signs. So they took a donation in January, £33,000 from PricewaterhouseCoopers. It didn't come in the form of cash, it came in the form of staff. So someone from PricewaterhouseCoopers came and helped the Labour Party develop policy, which is something they did back in the 2000s. And it was back in the 2000s, no less than Margaret Hodge said, well, why are we doing this? She pointed out that PricewaterhouseCoopers, the accountants and management consultants, was selling tax avoidance on an industrial scale. That's what Margaret Hodge says. So when they said, well, why is Labour taking borrowing staff from PricewaterhouseCoopers as a donation? She said, well, actually, that's wrong. And if Hodge said it was wrong, why is Labour doing it again under Starmer? I saw as well in the current Register of Members' Interests, Rachel Reeves, the new Shadow Chancellor, has got 25 grand for staffing from Victor Blank. Victor Blank he's a former banker. He's seen as a banker with a good reputation. I think that's not unfair, actually. He's probably not he had a conservative approach to banking in the run-up to the financial crisis. So arguably he was one of the better ones. But even so, the Shadow Chancellor being funded by one of the better bankers, don't be funded by a banker. You're the Shadow Chancellor. Your job is going to be to tell the banks not what to do, not to take advice from them, you would hope. So that, they'll get some, but it's that each sum is not as good as you can get from whatever 5,000, 10,000 members. It's just not as good, and it also always has this kind of something where it will make you do something wrong or embarrass you in some way.
Just quickly, lastly, before I'm going to bring in Raj shortly, just to talk over, of course, this horrendous case involving, of course, the Labour MP, but just some comments as well. But just to underline your points, Bahumanya Guy says the American study published as Golden Rule by Thomas Ferguson showed a direct correlation between donations and policies. Tajus Campwell says, in comparison with the amount left to the Tories in their wills, do these groups with the overall levels of money given? It would be interesting to compare the two. Is the left normalising everything Johnson does and therefore allowing him to get away with it? The nature of Johnson in terms of how he can, I suppose, get away with scandals which would have destroyed other politicians. Just finally, what I wanted to bring in was this splash in the Observer this week, this Sunday. Starmer Aid warns we've lost touch with target voters. That's Deborah Mattinson, the pollster who's been brought in. She's from Britain Thinks, but she's been brought in as the new head of strategy for Keir Starmer. The reason I think this is interesting is a few things, really. I mean, because I know you've got insights from Deborah Mattinson, but it's this whole strategy which Starmer and much of the Labour right have adopted of we're shit, everyone. We're really rubbish. I mean, we know we're rubbish. We are so out of touch. Oh my word! You know how out of touch? It's worse than you think. This self-flat, and please vote for us though. Yeah, and and there's also this, in politics you're supposed to show don't tell. And the problem with the Labour leadership is they keep doing things like, we're going to set out a vision. We're going to set out what we need to do. I mean, you shouldn't do that. You should just set it out rather than keep, because that's what happened, for example, after the by-election defeat in Hartlepool. Keir Starmer did this slightly odd interview where he was, like, oh, I'm going to spell out what needs to be done. It's like, spell it out now then. But yeah, just in terms of what you think about the strategy of telling the country constantly how rubbish and out of touch Labour is, and then expecting them to vote for them.
It's just it doesn't feel like a winner, does it? I think to some extent, though, I think what's happening actually is that that message isn't aimed at the population. It's aimed at bouncing the Labour Party membership into despair and demoralisation. That they've got a set of politics which they didn't win. Keir Starmer stood as a kind of soft left character, but he's moving away more into a kind of new Labour territory. So they didn't win that, and now they have to bounce people into it. So I just think they keep leaking these sort of Deborah Mattinson does focus groups, so she'll go and talk to 20 people who don't vote Labour and say, why don't you vote Labour, and then write down all the horrible things she says and then try and wave that around. It's a sort of strategy of, really, I suspect, my feeling is that they've brought back new Labour characters. Deborah Mattinson worked for, she was one of the group of advertising type people who worked to help develop New Labour. So they brought her back in at the top. They brought in Peter Mandelson as an advisor, and both of them do the same thing. They both say, actually, the population really wants right-wing things. They don't want you to increase taxation. But I just think it's ventriloquism. You can always find someone who'll say that, but I think it's that they don't want to increase taxation on the rich. They don't want massively increased social spending. They don't want stricter regulation. And I have to say, to some extent, it's just their business interests. Mattinson's Britain Thinks, she's set aside from that. She stepped aside from it, but that was how she made her career in business when she wasn't working for the Labour Party. They do polling and focus groups for McDonald's. They do it for Capita. They do it for Virgin. It's just they're from that. She's coming from that world. And equally, Peter Mandelson, one point was very much on the left, a young communist and what have you. But then he, went into government. But now he's come out the other end and set up a lobbying company called Global Council. We don't exactly know who they represent because they don't always list that as fully as they might. But we can tell in Europe they represent Banco Santander, they represent UK Finance, which is just a lobby group for UK banks. They represent the European Roundtable of Industry, which is just the big corporations. So you've got these consultants, these old New Labour consultants who've been rehashed. They come back and they say, really, Labour, everyone hates Labour. They'd love Labour if they would just abandon all their principles. Is it, or is that really just what their interests are, and they're ventriloquizing it through polling or insight or what have you? I don't think it's an election winner, but I just wonder if, to some extent, it's what is driving them is as much their personal interest as their interest in a particular form of Labour politics.
Solomon, it's been a real pleasure. We covered a huge amount of ground there, and to have your insight and expertise is a real privilege. So really, really appreciate you coming on. And do follow Solomon Hughes, obviously, on Twitter, where you'll see all sorts of very fascinating insights about what's going on really in politics. But cheers, Solomon. Really appreciate it.
Bye.
Take care, Solomon. Cheers. So I'm very glad now to bring in Raj Chada, who is the lawyer who represented Apsana Begum, the Labour MP, who has been, as I said at the beginning, completely and utterly vindicated, completely exonerated in court after facing prosecution by Tower Hamlets Council on charges of housing benefit related fraud. Raj, firstly, it's a big honour to have you. Though I think you're muted. I think we need to unmute you. Just checking. We want to hear your dulcet tones. That's better. Here we go. How you doing, Raj? Well, firstly, massive congratulations. Huge well done on this brilliant result.
Thank you very much. It was at last justice being done for Upsana, and it's been such a traumatic time for her. So just talk us through, because some people might not be familiar. I know we can obviously be careful. This is and you're a lawyer, so obviously we will tread carefully throughout. Could you just explain how this case originated, the circumstances of the case, and the prosecution
that was made. And on that, I mean, some people don't understand because they think generally they're familiar with Crown Prosecution Service prosecutions, where there was a very, very high threshold. The vast majority of CPS prosecutions end up with guilty verdicts. They only do them if they think they're going to win. This isn't. This was a local authority. So just talk us through, as best you can, the circumstances and the basis of the case.
So, as you say, many prosecutions, the vast majority of prosecutions are conducted by the Crown Prosecution Service, who have particular expertise and training in conducting prosecutions. This prosecution, as is often the case in local authority situations, was conducted by Tower Hamlets Council. And this was in relation to an allegation that Upsana had failed to update the council in relation to her living circumstances, so in effect getting a council house quicker than she should have done, jumping the queue, if you like. And there was a tip-off to the local council, interestingly, at about around the time that Upsana was being selected for her candidacy for Labour MP. Tower Hamlets investigate, and eventually they bring 3 charges against Upsana for not only failing to update them, but allegedly dishonestly failing to update them. And those allegations were completely disproven, if you like, in court. The jury found her not guilty, and she's been completely vindicated.
So, in terms of what you suggested in the trial, that the council should have handed the investigation to the police, and I don't know in terms of the original complaint and factions within Tower Hamlet. I don't know how much you can speak about that.
Well, what we showed and was pretty obvious had investigators looked at it in a bit more detail, was that original complaint may well have originated from another Labour councillor, and indeed a Tory councillor as well, submitting complaints to Tower Hamlets Council, another complaint going to the Labour Party, all around about the time of Upsana's selection. And there was clearly someone else who was keen to draw this allegation to the authorities' attention. So that was the first issue. The second issue is obviously local councils, and we've no criticism of how the officers themselves conducted the investigation in terms of whether they were subject to pressure by politicians, but inevitably they are political institutions. And whether it's really right that a local council was handling this particular investigation, which drew into it other local councillors, drew into it committee meetings, seems to us, certainly in retrospect, to have been a mistake.
Now, this was a horrendous ordeal for Upsana to go through, and it was made all the worse by, particularly online, the Islamophobia, the misogyny, the bile that she was subjected to by accounts. And I have to say, not just conservative supporting accounts, but some associated with right-wing factions within the Labour Party who were clearly desperately gunning for a guilty verdict and were tweeting as though Upsana was guilty. They were full of glee. For example, the Spectator Diary columnist tweeted about how John McDonnell, the former Shadow Chancellor and the Labour MP for Hayes and Harlington, gave a character witness in support of Upsana and how she would have been made his PPS were he to have become Chancellor in a Labour victory. Hasn't tweeted anything about the results since. I mean, tell me about the pressure that, I mean, for one thing, how that risks, obviously, justice being done with all of that online, and the impact of that, because this is a young Muslim woman, and who was subjected to, and John McKenzie played a huge part in that. So tell me about that whole element and the impact on the case and on Upsana.
Well, I think the first thing was the deep irresponsibility of some parts of the mainstream media and indeed some social media accounts in tweeting during the course of the trial. After day one, we had to bring up before the judge at least 2 newspapers who had printed errors. That was not the case against Upsana, where they had used completely different words than had been used in court. And that's really unforgivable, because that risked the trial process itself. And then secondly, the level of vile and vitriol directed towards Muslim MPs is quite astonishing. Really, Apsana had to deal with a huge amount, and she dealt with it in a heroic and calm way. But I saw the tweets because we kept a daily eye on them, brought them before the judge, but they were Islamophobic, they prejudiced the trial, they tried to suggest, for example, her hand should be cut off, she should be deported. Pretty vile stuff. And something is going wrong either with the platforms or with these account holders, that sort of thing can be allowed at all, and particularly during a trial.
Now, this was a jury verdict, so I'm just interested in terms of her exoneration, the basis, the defence, obviously the very successful defence that you mounted. What was the basis for the victory, basically?
So Apsana made clear that she had notified by telephone to Tower Hamlets Council the changes that she was required to notify. And there is some evidence, clearly, that local authorities' systems may not be the best at recording such calls. But secondly, at the time, she admits that she didn't email them, which perhaps in retrospect she should have done, but she was under a huge amount of pressure at that time. She was a victim of honour-based violence or threat of violence from her family, a victim of potentially domestic abuse, she said, during the course of her trial in relation to her relationship. And the idea that she had made a telephone call, but she didn't email, that should find the basis of a criminal prosecution is what we found so disappointing. And clearly the jury agreed.
Just a couple of final things. I mean, Apsana spoke about this in her statement about looking to help ensure this doesn't happen to other people. So I guess what lessons can be drawn to make sure this doesn't repeat itself?
I do think that investigators need to be trained and to recognize issues of coercion or issues of domestic abuse and understand how that may affect those that suffer from that at the time. And I do think that was lacking in some of the investigators' approach, that they clearly need to recognize their duties under the criminal legislation about investigating not only issues that might support the prosecution, but issues that might support the defense. And the criminal justice system as a whole probably needs to recognize how to deal with people who give evidence and say they're victims themselves of domestic abuse and how that affects their actions. It's a traumatic thing to relive, and it's a traumatic thing to relive in a court, but it's a traumatic thing to relive when it's being replayed in the newspapers and in social media constantly.
Finally, I don't know if you've got any thoughts on this, but look, I mean, Apsana is on the left of the Labour Party. She is not close to the current Labour leadership. And she's a young Muslim woman. She's a woman of colour. She hasn't been inundated, I would say, with solidarity from senior Labour figures. There have been Labour MPs who've spoken out. They tend to be associated with the left or themselves. We've seen, for example, some politicians, people of colour, Labour MPs who've spoken out. But actually, generally speaking, I just wonder if this had been maybe someone close to the Labour leadership, I just don't think there would have been this silence. I mean, what do you think? I mean, maybe that lack of solidarity, do you think that's striking?
Well, I think I would hope that solidarity is one of the founding planks of the Labour movement. And there was some solidarity, and great credit to people like John McDonnell, who came to court and gave a character witness, knowing full well how that would be treated by the right-wing media. Yet John had no hesitation and came at short notice. And I think that's a tribute to him and his idea of standing by people and giving his honest account of what he thought of Apsana. I do hope that the wider Labour leadership display similar levels of solidarity now. Upsana has been completely cleared and completely vindicated. And I hope that she continues to stand up for her constituents in the way that she's done, and that she has a huge career in front of her in the Labour Party.
Raj, thank you so much for joining us and just talking through those details. Really appreciate it. You're actually on holiday, so taking a break from your holiday course. So I hope you can kind of enjoy the rest of that. So we particularly appreciate it. But it's a great victory. So huge congratulations, and of course solidarity with Upsana after everything she's gone through too. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Take care, Raj. Take care. Great stuff. Well, it's great to have two brilliant guests to talk through two very different but very, very important issues. This week on the channel, hopefully we now resume normal service after I've got over COVID-19. I can leave I can leave my flat from midnight tonight. Very exciting. Watch out, London. But we've got loads of stuff coming up. We've got this documentary we are working on about who really owns Britain. If you want to support that with, £3 or whatever you can spare to our team, it's a huge amount of time and resources, but it will be worth it. I am absolutely convinced. Then you can do that on patreon.com/OwenJones84. Also, do like this video and do subscribe. I want to thank the people who supported on Super Chat all the way through the show. Simeon Wakely, I said Simon before, so apologies for that. Simeon Wakely, I used to work for Simeon, so that makes it even worse. Stephen Calder, Tajush Campwell, a regular who were very, very tough to have. Bahumanya Guy, John McKenzie, another regular, brilliant. As ever, thanks for your support. Mellow Maggot and Woody, thank you so much. As I said, we've got loads of stuff coming up. We've got video about the privatisation of the National Health Service, legislation being driven through by the Conservatives, very little press scrutiny, media scrutiny about that. That's what we're here for, to do what other media outlets are failing to do. So we'll have a very interesting video with two leading experts on that. If you want to help suggest who we interview and what we talk about, then on patreon.com/OwenJones84. Grant Sloan has just also put in support on Super Chat. So thank you, Grant. If you're listening on the podcast, thank you so much. And do also subscribe to that and leave a review if you feel so well inclined. But as I said, we've got loads and loads to go now, especially I'm feeling better. So raring to go out in the outside world, speaking truth to power, taking on the elites, giving a platform to voices that are otherwise not heard. That's the point of this. We're not bankrolled by billionaires, so we do appreciate your support. So thank you so much, not least because obviously I have no technical ability and the hard work is not done by my prepubescent looking Macaulay Culkin face, but by others who do far better work than me, but obviously aren't in front of the camera. Anyway, thank you so much. Lots of love and solidarity. Have a great day, whatever you're doing. I will see you live next Sunday, but we will have videos during the week, and we have our documentary, thanks to you, which will be coming out on who really owns Britain. Take care, everyone. See you soon.